Hello everyone, and welcome back to another tutorial video. In today's video, we're going to go over how I did this top darker part of Jordan Peterson's hair. So we're just starting with some charcoal powder and the firmer, smaller art brush just to create the general darker shapes of the top of the hair, for which we can erase some details into later, as well as use some graphite and pit oil base pencil to create some more details into this later. And for larger areas like this, it's appropriate to use a larger art brush or makeup brush just like this to cover a little bit larger area. And to go a little bit darker on the values with this charcoal powder and this type of brush, you paradoxically actually want to, although you do want to load up tons of powder onto the brush, but you just want to very gently rub it onto the page. You don't want to press very hard, as that's going to actually subtract some of that charcoal powder off the page. So you just want to kind of gently rub it onto the page. A nice generous layer of charcoal powder, gently rub it onto the page. And I find that using a firmer, harder, potentially smaller makeup brush like the one that I was using before actually can press in some of that charcoal powder into the page even further without removing it, so it can actually make it a little bit darker. So for the darkest values with charcoal powder, I'm actually using that smaller art brush, the blue one that you saw me use earlier. This one right here. And right here you can see exactly what I'm talking about, going in with that harder brush, and you see how that stroke was a little bit darker than the rest of the charcoal powder that I laid down, as well as this line right here. It's because I'm using that smaller, harder brush that actually presses the charcoal powder a little bit deeper into the page without rubbing it away. So I'm just going to be following these steps right here for the next 8 or 9 minutes until about the 12-minute mark. So just sit back, relax, enjoy the music, or you can skip ahead to that point and see what steps coming up next. Okay, so what I'm doing here is a little bit unorthodox, but remember what I was saying earlier, how the brush tends to rub away some of the charcoal powder off the page and it doesn't get quite as dark? Well, I've learned that for larger sections that are big enough for me to use my finger and it's a solid black area, I kind of lean towards using my finger to cover that area in charcoal powder, because the issue with having the charcoal powder not being pushed into the page deep enough and it not getting dark enough just doesn't happen when you're using your finger. For whatever reason, it completely blends it in perfectly and pushes it in to the paper without rubbing any of it off. So I highly recommend dipping your finger in some charcoal powder for larger, darker areas like this. And as you can see, look how dark and smooth this area of the hair is just because I'm using my finger. So I know that it does kind of look like I'm undoing the steps at the start of the video, but sometimes I change my mind as I'm going along with the drawing, and some things are working and some things perhaps aren't working. But the tips that I shared earlier with the bigger and smaller brushes definitely still hold true, so I would still definitely take note of that. And if anything, that almost can serve as a lesson in and of itself. The fact that you're never going to usually get anything completely accurate the first time around. Like, I'm quite an experienced artist, and as you can see, I'm still jumping back and forth and trying new things and reworking areas of the drawing that I previously thought looked great, but maybe I wanted to try a new technique. So if I'm bouncing around from different parts of the drawing and reworking different areas and trying new techniques and potentially starting over on some parts or changing my mind entirely on an approach which I want to take for a particular part, much like you saw in this video, then you guys are probably going to be doing the same thing as well. And I actually would highly recommend that you let yourself and encourage yourself to do this as well. And right here, when I'm working the background with the brush, I was noticing again that the brush was actually creating some brush strokes into that background, and it was again subtracting some of that charcoal powder off the page. It's always a balance between adding the charcoal to the page and not subtracting charcoal off the page at the same time. It's very difficult to balance that. So as you could see, I was using my finger to blend that in even further. This is a very underrated technique that I really don't see anyone else using, perhaps because it seems childish or unprofessional or messy or whatever. But hey, I'm only interested in what works. I'm not interested in anything else. And even though it's hard to see in this video, I am using the General's 6B charcoal pencil here to create some slightly darker hairs, a little bit darker than the layer of charcoal powder that I rubbed into the page with my finger. One of the most overlooked and underrated aspects of achieving realism is attaining really accurate relative values. So the wider the range of values that you can achieve, the more realistic the drawing is going to look, assuming that the proportions and stuff are on point already. And what I mean by that is it's not quite enough to have the hair looking completely dark like this. There are very subtle areas that are ever so slightly darker and ever so slightly lighter. And that's really what makes a good portrait look like a great portrait, because it just looks so much more realistic. Because in real life, there are an infinite amount of different values that you can perceive. So the more values that you can attain on a drawing, the better off you're going to be. And I do find one of the hardest things, for me at least, is achieving differences in value at the dark end. So going from really, really pitch black to just really dark to slightly dark to just a little bit dark. I find that achieving differences in value in this darker range to be the most difficult. And I find it actually quite easy to go from extremely light to slightly lighter to medium tone to dark tone. But when working with charcoal, to have varying values, all that are really dark but different, but very slightly different values that are all in that dark range, I find that very challenging, especially if it's a gradual shift. And I usually achieve this by applying different amounts of charcoal powder to the brush, pressing either harder or softer, or using different brushes that perform slightly different when it interacts with charcoal. And then for some of the most darkest layers, I love coming back in afterwards with the Faber-Castell pit oil based pencil on top of the charcoal to create the most darkest values. And that pit oil based pencil also just self blends so beautifully, especially when you use it on top of charcoal or charcoal powder. It just blends in that charcoal powder even further and just makes it darker if that's what you want, and really, really smooth. Anyway, that concludes today's hair tutorial, part 1 of drawing Jordan Peterson's hair. I hope you guys learned a thing or two and enjoyed the video. Stay tuned for part 2. I hope you guys all have a great day, and I will see you guys in that next video.